Anthony Fauci has hit back at claims he covered up the origins of COVID-19 to protect his own reputation. The man who was technically Fauci's boss during the pandemic, Robert Kadlec, gave me an exclusive interview where he said that Fauci tried to downplay the notion that COVID leaked from a lab because his agency had been funding research in Wuhan. Kadlec was the former Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the US Department of Health. He led Operation Warp Speed to develop COVID vaccines. In my interview with him, Kadlec admitted to conversations that he personally had with Fauci where they decided to downplay the idea of a lab leak. He told me, and I quote, "I think Tony Fauci was trying to protect his institution and his own reputation from the possibility that his agency was funding the Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers who, beyond the scope of the grants received from the National Institutes of Health, may have been working with People's Liberation Army researchers on defensive coronavirus vaccines." He said, "I think it's evident from his later released emails obtained via FOI that he, Fauci, had more sense of what his institute had funded at that moment." Kadlec says this was a reputational risk to him and his institute, and certainly he probably sided with international scientists that believed that false or unsubstantiated accusations could have a chilling effect on scientific collaboration between the Western world and China. Kadlec says when we talked about this in advance of that call, he, Fauci, would just try and see if he could get the scientists to take the temperature down, turn the rhetoric down. And it went on in that article I wrote a couple of weeks ago in The Australian. This extraordinary revelation made headlines globally.
This comes as Dr. Fauci's former boss suggests the former White House advisor might have silenced the science on the Wuhan lab to protect his own reputation. Sky News host Sharri Markson broke the story in The Australian.
In Robert Kadlec's own admission, this is a deliberate decision to deflect attention away from the Wuhan lab, and he says he thinks Anthony Fauci was trying to protect his own interests.
Well, Anthony Fauci has now hit back at these claims while not actually denying them. Clearly worried about his PR in Australia, he did an interview last night with The Project where Waleed Ali asked him about Kadlec's comments.
What's your response to what he said?
What is so unfortunate is what's happened with rumor and innuendo and conspiracy theory. If you look at the things like emails, I said what you need to do is to, in a very open way, get a number of the best scientists in the world and take a look at that. And if in fact it's true, we should notify the FBI, MI5, and everybody. That is documented in an email. And then after it was over, I then also summarized saying, what you need to do is when you make your decision, publish it in the open literature so that it can be peer reviewed by everybody. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like a cover-up.
So Fauci not actually denying that they deliberately downplayed suggestions the virus leaked from a lab. But in that interview, he did double down on his claim the whole way through that the virus was natural.
Despite the disinformation that goes around about conspiracies and things like that. But then you say to yourself, take a look at what are the data that would strongly indicate one versus the other. Not TikTok and tweeting, but scientific reviewed literature that give not conclusive proof, but strong evidence that it's a natural occurrence, superimposed upon the historical perspective that this has happened before with SARS-CoV-1, with MERS. Then you look at the other side of the coin and you say, what are the evidence suggestive or otherwise, that it's a lab leak? And you know what the answer to that is? Zero.
Now, Anthony Fauci also did say in that interview that it could have been a lab leak, but as you heard, that was his view on how the pandemic started. Now, while we don't know where the virus came from, and intelligence agencies are also split on whether it leaked from a lab or not, the FBI says it did, others don't think it did. But there are a couple of points about what Fauci just said. Firstly, there is no evidence that the virus is natural. Despite the best efforts of scientists, no intermediary animal host has been found. The only reason, as Fauci just gave, to claim that the virus could be natural is that this is how some coronavirus outbreaks have started before, as he said. But coronavirus outbreaks in Beijing have also started before with a lab leak. So both a lab leak and natural origins have been responsible for outbreaks in the past. Secondly, there is actually a preponderance of evidence that links the Wuhan Institute of Virology to COVID-19. It's not incontrovertible or conclusive, but there is a lot of evidence. There were biocontainment failures at the WIV. The scientists were conducting gain-of-function research on coronaviruses. A grant proposal by the Wuhan Institute of Virology has leaked, which scientists say is a blueprint for the creation of SARS-CoV-2. And the WIV has refused to release its database of around 22,000 viruses, which it took offline in 2019. This lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology also houses the world's largest collection of viruses and was conducting gain-of-function research into them. Oh, and its scientists fell sick in November 2019 with COVID-like symptoms in what some intelligence agencies suspect was the first cluster of the pandemic. And for more detail on all of that, you can read my book. Fauci also still holds up that proximal origins paper authored by a group of international scientists in the early days of the pandemic to say that the virus didn't leak from a lab. But another group of prestigious international scientists are now calling for that paper to be retracted. A key reason the journal Nature Medicine hasn't retracted it is because they say it's effectively an opinion piece, a commentary, not a piece of rigorous scientific research. And I reported recently on a scientific paper produced by intelligence agency scientists that absolutely demolished that paper. The Defense Intelligence Agency's National Center for Medical Intelligence, a document that they produced, states that the proximal origins paper, and I quote, does not prove that the virus arose naturally. In fact, the features of SARS-CoV-2 noted by Anderson et al. Are consistent with another scenario, that SARS-CoV-2 was developed in a laboratory by methods that leading coronavirus researchers commonly use. That paper by the world's most qualified scientists working for the intelligence community. But now to the most curious statement Anthony Fauci made in that interview with Waleed Ali last night. Have a look.
I think people would be interested, though, in this idea that you were funding research with that Wuhan lab. A, were you? And B, is that fairly common practice?
Oh, it's totally common practice. We fund labs throughout the world, including Australia. And another thing that gets lost in the translation, it was a $120,000 grant out of a $6 billion budget. We call that pencil dust when it comes to funding. And I'm glad you're giving me the opportunity to say this, because if you look at the viruses that they were studying, they were doing surveillance to try and determine, are there viruses out in the environment that actually have the capability of infecting humans. They weren't doing anything to make them infect humans.
And Fauci repeated the term paper dust. As you would have heard there that he said this was a $120,000 grant. Well, that is a lie. Now, Fauci would not have been too keen for people to question why his agency was funding risky research in a lab where the US had no oversight and where there was involvement by the Chinese military. But let's have a look at that $120,000 figure that he cited. This report, and you can't get more credible, is the United States Government Accountability Office report to Congress. The United States Government Accountability Office report to Congress. It's titled NIH, National Institutes for Health, could take additional actions to manage risks involving foreign sub-recipients. And that's what the Wuhan Institute of Virology was, a sub-recipient. It states, this report, that the Wuhan University, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the Academy of Military Medical Sciences received 7 sub-awards totaling over $2 million from 2014 to 2021 from 2 US agencies, the National Institutes of Health and the US Agency for International Development. The money was funneled through EcoHealth Alliance and other American universities. In total, $1.4 million went from the US to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, just in that short time frame, 2014 to 2021, and about $600,000 of that from the NIH. Now, what did that money go towards? And I quote, understanding the risk of bat coronavirus emergence. It was this project that saw the scientists go into caves in the Yunnan province and collect bat samples and take them back to their lab in Wuhan for experimentation. Now, the NIH also gave $200,000 directly to the Wuhan University, and we've seen recently in emails that have been subpoenaed by Congress that Fauci early in the pandemic admitted that Wuhan University was also doing gain-of-function research. Now, separately, there's this grant document obtained under Freedom of Information laws that shows that from 2019 until 2024, $3.5 million was awarded to the Wuhan Institute of Virology investigator Ben Hu via EcoHealth Alliance. And that was from Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for, and I quote, understanding the risk of bat coronavirus emergence. And that investigator, Ben Hu, by the way, he's the scientist dubbed Patient Zero because he was one of the 3 to first fall sick with COVID-like symptoms in November 2019, and he was hospitalized. And it's this exact reason why many question whether American funding may have led to the creation of COVID-19. So once again here, Anthony Fauci's statements do not stand up to scrutiny. And US Republican Rand Paul thinks there should be a perjury probe and charges brought against Fauci for lying to Congress when he falsely claimed the US wasn't funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan. So good on Waleed Ali for asking Fauci about this topic. And remember, the ABC and the Sydney Morning Herald had interviews with Fauci a week earlier. They didn't bother to ask him about this at all, as Chris Mitchell pointed out in his column in The Australian this week. But look how Fauci tries to pretend he's welcoming the questions in the clip I'm about to show you, despite repeatedly refusing to do an actual detailed interview with me on this topic.
That paper in the Journal of Infectious Diseases sounds fascinating. Have you thought of publishing it on TikTok?
I don't do social media, period.
It's going to be hard to win the fight. It's going to be hard to win the fight. Dr. Anthony Fauci, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.